And how many of you can remember when the day JFK was shot? And many of you who lived at that, it's like embedded in your memory. Those are the kind of memories we have from that time. And then suddenly came this thing we called the Vietnam conflict. I have one more handout, and I promise that's it. And this is a little overview on the war that I was able to obtain from the internet. I didn't write it, but it's a pretty good summary of the war from beginning to end. And it's just there for a little reference. But let me, if I could have on the PowerPoint, let's go to the next slide. And just to talk about the times, they were times of turmoil, and that's why I read about the eve of destruction. Next point. There was a thing in those days called the draft, and every young man in our country was required to enroll with what's called a selective service, and if you were not going to college or you were able-bodied, you were drafted into the Army without enlisting. Any former draftees among the veterans here? We got a few hands going up that we didn't ask. They signed us up, and I was going to college at Fairfield University at the time, and I had lost my dad when I was a senior. And it was a tumultuous time for me individually. And I found myself in college, but my mind was not on my studies like it should have been. I could have been an excellent student, but I just found I kept telling my mom I want to take a couple years off and maybe work and just mature a little, find out what I really want to do. And my mother wasn't approving of that, and so I ended up quitting school, much to her chagrin, and I lost my deferment. As long as you're going to college, you had a deferment, so they wouldn't draft you. And what happened is within 6 weeks, I got a letter saying that I was to report. There would be a bus picking me up in my hometown of Ansonia, Connecticut. Took me to Fort Dix. You're in the Army now. And that began my military career. The Cold War, which was taking place at that time, had tension all over the world. And next point here, there was a threat of communism. The big thing that Russia had promised to take over the United States internally, or somehow we were afraid of Russia. They had the bomb, we had the bomb. And then you have Red China. And Red China was advancing in Southeast Asia in threatening to come down and bring communism. And I think the United States was afraid, it's on the handout, that ultimately all of the Far East would fall to communism, and we need to put forces there to prevent that from happening. I was drafted, yes, but I also have a heritage. My name is Howard Russell Renker. That's my middle name. I'm named after two uncles on my mother's side, Howard Wilson and Russell Wilson. Both of them were in the D-Day invasion in World War II. They landed on the beaches at Normandy. And in fact, I got an aunt, she's still alive today, that my Uncle Howard, my namesake, brought back from Belgium from the war. He came and found his wife over there and brought her home. A living testimony that lots of things happen in wartime. And she's outlived all my other aunts and uncles, and she lives over in Kensington. I was brought up in a Protestant church and had a sense of God, and I had a sense of country. Many of you who are here remember when we saluted the flag and we said the Pledge of Allegiance and we prayed in school and things like that. And so I had within me a loyalty to God and country, and therefore I thought it was my duty to follow in the footsteps of my relatives and serve my country honorably. And and I was drafted in 1966. It was before a lot of the protests began about this particular war. And so I was gladly serving my country. However, when I got to my advanced training, I went through basic training in Fort Carson, Colorado, went to advanced training, and I was in Fort Ord, California. And they notified me, they said, look, they're getting ready to deploy this whole unit. You're going to go to Vietnam. And the company commander called me in and said to me, well, Renker, we got your results from some tests you took at the induction center, and it looks like you would qualify for officer's school if you'd like to go. And I said, well, look, I'm drafted for 2 years. And why would I want to go? Because if you go to officer school, you have to go through officer school, then spend another year. So I'd end up having to spend 3 years in the Army. He said, well, look, here's the way this works. Just lest you think I'm a big war hero of some sort. It works this way. He says, well, you're going to go to Vietnam. And would you rather be the point man or the flank man? Or would you rather be in the middle surrounded by all the other soldiers? Because if you're an officer, fewer officers got killed in Vietnam. And in fact, if you go to officer school, they might send you into Army intelligence or Army security, and they might send you to Germany, or you might end up in Hawaii. And right there, I said, sign me up right there. And so I ended up, I'll spend for the chance of not even going to the war. And so I went to Army Infantry Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia, and spent some time after that going to being an executive officer of a basic training company for a couple cycles for Polk, Louisiana. But then I got orders to go to Vietnam, and but they sent me to jungle school in Panama. I like to tell my kids this. I said, your dad is a jungle expert. Because I got a badge that says if you go, it's a 2-week school, but I don't care. The U.S. government says I'm a jungle expert. I'm a jungle expert. And what we had to do for that was in Panama, we learned to eat boa constrictors and monkey meat and turtle eggs and how to determine what's a poisonous plant from a non-poisonous. I'm a Boy Scout. I was in the Boy Scouts, and this is like being a Boy Scout on crack. I mean, we were having a good time down at. I thought it was just the greatest thing to go to jungle school, and plus it was delaying my going to Vietnam too. All right. So we get over into the war in Vietnam. Next slide. So I had a personal involvement in investment. Next slide, please. Okay, in Vietnam I want you to know there's China to the north, and as you come down, North Vietnam and then South Vietnam, and North Vietnam was communist. South Vietnam, down in this area, was kind of under American control. We had a puppet president in the country, but it was literally greatly under the influence of the U.S., and we wanted to hold back the North from taking over the entire country. To the west, you can see Cambodia and Thailand in these areas. And just to give you a little point of reference, my time in Vietnam was spent right here in a place called Cu Chi. It was just maybe half an hour or so from 40 minutes by vehicle from Saigon. And during the Tet Offensive, a part of that battle, we actually spent time in Saigon. I've been in Saigon and to some of the airfields around and about it. And the war in Vietnam, though, was guerrilla warfare. It wasn't conventional warfare. It wasn't like World War I or World War II. This was largely guerrilla warfare. And you can go to the next slide. So the country, let's take a look at this first of all. Okay, the country was far away. We were a long way from home. By the time we flew us over there, we're like on the other side of the world. Next slide. It was very hot. I'll say this, I know I have, my grandchildren are here today, and I'm really happy to have them over there. But this might be a little funny, I'm going to just share it. But it was so hot that they said, you are not going to wear underwear for the whole year. First time in my life I ever went a year without wearing underwear. But they gave us uniforms that dried quickly. They were high technology uniforms. And the idea was you would be going through canals and water, and you'd be sweating 100, 120 degrees sometimes, and profusely. One of the problems with dehydration, you had to drink a lot of water. And if you got wet, they wanted you to dry out, or if you sweat, they wanted you to be dry out and not get other types of elements that could come your way from that. So it was also, next point, it was very different. I mean, it's a different culture. The towns and cities didn't look like much that was here. Villages with grass huts and The little children there, just so you know, little children there don't wear any underpants at all, where they go around naked up until the age of 3 or 4 years old, and they pee and poop in the streets. And wherever, so the kids, no potty training there, no Pampers there, no diapers there. I said, they know how to save money over here. I remember having to buy diapers for my kids, but there was none of that over there. But the villages had the distinct smell of these things when you walk through them, plus chickens running around, and some villages had water buffalo and cooking over open fires, and the food and the smells. They have their version of ketchup, and it was something called Nuit Bogdan, which is a sauce they make from dead fish. They put dead fish, and they put it out in the sun in this, they make a mud thing over it, and they bake it in the sun till it all decomposes. They add some spices, some chilies, and some peppers, and maybe some pineapple, and they let this thing fester and fester. Then they tap a hole and bottle it up, and that's what they put on their food. And you can smell, if you're a Westerner, you can smell that stuff a mile away. To me, the whole country smelled like that. I never put it on anything. And but it was there, and it was a very different in look and smell. Next of all, it was an agrarian culture. In other words, they farmed, they grew rice, they subsisted on what they grew around their villages. This was an ancient culture. And it often meant, when I was there, that we questioned, what am I doing here? That the war is probably something that somebody sitting in a big office somewhere came up with for political reasons. But the people of Vietnam were a simple people. I mean, you could go into a village in a hut, and in that hut you had great-grandma, great-grandpa, grandma, grandpa, and mom and dad, and all the children, all in one hut, small, like a 10 by 12 hut. They're all living it. Don't ask me how they did it, but they would all live together in great intimacy in these villages. However, the enemy over there, you had South Vietnam, you had North Vietnam, the enemy and the friendly people in the South Vietnam, they all look the same. You can put the next point up. Friends and enemies, you never knew who your enemy was over there. Everyone looked alike. And so we would go in a village, we didn't know if it was a friendly village or whether it was supposed to be a friendly village, or it could have been an enemy village. And we didn't know if sometimes the people in the villages, we'd go through the villages, they were friendly by day and they would put on their black uniforms, and they call them Viet Cong. That was the resistance. They were resisting the Westerners coming into their country. They were your enemy at night. And we had them cleaning on our base camp. They were cleaning our barracks and giving us haircuts. You go to the barber, and we found out later on in Cu Chi, the main base camp, that the top spies, Viet Cong spies, were the barbers. And they would listen to the people over talking when they get their haircut, and then they would go out and they would bomb this one or attack that place, or send rockets into another place. So a very interesting place. So you're getting your haircut and you say, this guy could stab me in the back, or this. And they also had, okay, so we'll go to the guerrilla warfare. First thing here, booby traps. Since we weren't fighting an all-out force in the area of Vietnam I was in, then they would set booby traps. They would take an unexploded artillery round and hook a trigger to it and put a tripwire across the trail. So you'd be walking down the trail, you trip the wire, an explosion takes place, 2-3 guys get wounded, maybe somebody gets killed, and there's no enemy to fight. And I have had men in my platoon, I was a platoon leader while I was there, that got wounded in these ways. And then you're carrying them out. And every day you go out. And the next thing is punji pits. Maybe somebody here knows what a punji pit is, maybe not, but they would dig a hole in the ground, and they would put sharpen the ends of bamboo sticks and stick it in human feces, and so they would be contaminated, and then line this hole with sticks pointing upward and inward, and then covered up, camouflage it, so as you walked, if you stepped, your foot went down and those sticks went in your legs, and you would be totally infected by the stuff on the end of those sticks. And so you never know where these things were, and you had to be careful where you walked and all that. The number 3, we had snipers. These would be a Viet Cong. They would have a few rounds. They'd sit up in a tree. They'd see you coming. And I have a book that was written by the Viet Cong leaders after the war, and it got translated into English. And they said, we love the Americans. They make such big targets. It's so easy to pick them off. And I'm thinking to myself, holy smoke. When I got home, I got more scared, I think, than when I was there. Because just around any bend, there could be a sniper. He shoots one or two, shoots a few rounds. Somebody's dead, somebody's gone. And then you never even saw them. They go climb down a tree, get on their bicycle, and ride away. And so you don't get to literally engage them in regular warfare. Now, my unit in Vietnam, I had what was called a weapons platoon in our company. And it was supposed to have, according to the Army charts, you're supposed to have 33 soldiers in that weapons platoon. And at one time, I was down to 9 men because of those who were wounded. And they didn't send enough replacements. Wounded, injured, killed, and then people transferring out also and not having replacement. We're going out in the field with 9 men in our platoon. And our company that's supposed to have like 150 men, sometimes we go out with 40 men at certain times. So, and mainly because of this. Number 4 is ambushes. Ambushes are where they're waiting for you. And if they have advance, they know you're coming. And you're walking down the trail, and we used to walk, and we'd walk in 2 columns, typically, through the jungle or wherever we're going, and then outwardly we had flank people a little further out, and then point people went forward. They were supposed to see or be the eyes and ears of the rest of the unit, and sometimes they would let the point people go by them, but they would be hidden in holes in the ground, covered in camouflage. They knew we were coming. We get our columns right in between where they were, and where they might be on one side or the other, we never knew, and we walk right over them, and when we get, all of a sudden, they would pop up, and there could be 20, 50 of them, all of a sudden open fire on us, and we wouldn't, before we could even react to it, people were going down, people were getting killed, people were being wounded. And I was in 3 ambushes, and the funny story is for me that in the war, when I first got there, I was actually sent to a Roman Catholic village, friendly village, to train the local there on how to fire their weapon, give them basic training, because I had experience in basic training at Fort Polk. And so I spent my first 3 months in Vietnam living in a village. There were only 9 of us Americans in an entire village of South Vietnamese, but they were friendly, and they were Catholics. They were friendly to the West. They had a Christian faith. And so I spent time there. And then finally they said, that's over. I got on a helicopter. I went out to a place where my unit was, out in the field. I met my platoon. They got me in there about 7 o'clock at night. It was getting dark. I got to introduce myself. I'm the new lieutenant. I'm in charge of this platoon. The next morning we get up and we go out and we were supposed to secure this road. They wanted to bring supplies through that area. We had to go make sure the road was secure. And so this is my first day with a regular unit out in the field. It was December of 1967. And we went out, and I'm going to say we went from here to R.W. Hine. That's how far. We walked out, and all of a sudden, the next thing I know, all hell broke loose. Guns were firing, grenades were going off. We were ambushed. I heard people screaming. It was chaotic. I remember falling to the ground, and the bullets were flying over my head. I could hear them. You know, it's one thing when you go through training, you're shooting the rifle and it's going that way. It's a totally different sound when the bullets are coming this way at you, and they're zinging over my head. I want you to know that day I ate dirt. I put my head down. I tried to make my body as thin as it could possibly be, and then I had to get on the radio, and the captain says, "What's going on? What's the status of your unit?" I says, "It's all hell." I remember saying, "It's all hell down here." And after that ambush, I could hear the enemy soldiers. I could hear them yelling and screaming. They were only about as far as the deck out, as far as that wall away. So a grenade could have come over. I mean, I was scared. I was scared, but I was supposed to be the platoon leader. So I said, something said, "You got to stop being scared. You got to get it on the radio and talk and this kind of thing, but you're scared." And you say, one wrong move, you're a goner. And that was my first day out in active unit. I said, oh my, I got to go till next October. This is going to be a long war. If it keeps up like this is going to be a long war. And there was, we were ambushed 2 other times too. And on top of that, let me just go to the next one. I'll spend too much time on all this. Mortar fire, that's where they have a thing, they put a rocket in a tube and shoot it up and it comes in. And they could send that into your base camp, no matter, you were never safe. And I did have an incident where there was mortar fire coming in one day. And I didn't have to be in my barracks, but when I went back, the mortar round had hit the roof. It was a metal roof on the building, hit the metal roof. In my entire bed, I took the sheet off of my bed, and it was all full of holes from where the mortar round had hit that zone. The interesting thing was I wanted to take a nap that afternoon. And my friends came and said, Howard, we happened to be on what was formerly a French plantation, and there was a swimming pool. Let's go swimming. I said, I'm tired. I want to take a nap. Come on, we're all going down. We'll have a few beers and all this kind of stuff. And so I went with all my friends, and then the mortar rounds flew in while we were down at the swimming pool. And they were off in a distance. And when I went back, it had hit a direct hit right over my bed. If I had taken that nap, there's no telling. I might not be here, be talking to you tonight. So praise God for it. Now, the next thing is we were in a place, anyone here ever hear of the tunnels of Vietnam? They had dug tunnels under the ground that you could go over, I'm going to say this, 24 kilometers, which is about 10 miles. They could go down under the ground and go underground for 10 miles and then come up. They had hospitals underground. And we happened to be right in the area where they had all of these tunnels. And so the third ambush that I was involved in was really horrible. They popped out of tunnels and you'd shoot and they'd go down in their tunnels. And then they would, you couldn't get them, and then they could go down the tunnel and then pop up over here and shoot at you here. So now you're all getting to fire at them over there. And then we'd go down and they would come up and they go over, and then they showed up on the tunnel over there and hit you from over there. So it's like they were ambushing you and you had no way of getting back to them. And so now we're walking through village. They had tunnels in the villages. You could go, it was, let me just say, it was horrible fighting this war. Next thing, friendly fire. Many people, how many of you know what friendly fire is? Some of the veterans do. But friendly fire is, we could call in airstrikes, we could call in artillery to bring from a distance fire, but they had to know our position. So let's say the enemy's out there in the street and we're here, and we know the enemy's there. Rather than engaging them, we can call in artillery on top of them. But sometimes the artillery, be honest with you, didn't get it right. And the first round that would come in would land on our unit instead and kill our own guys and wound our own guys. And then you had to get on the radio and say, whoa, 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 you're off target. You know, you got to go 100 yards in such and such a direction because you got friendly fire. And I have an interesting story. Actually, in September, I'm going to be meeting up with my platoon again. We were walking along a canal that from the canals they irrigate rice paddies, and we were walking around the canal, and it's wooded along the canal, and we were walking kind of along the woods along this canal, and I saw a helicopter coming from a distance. It was a U.S. helicopter, a gun, what they call a gunship. This has like Gatling gun kind of guns and rockets and machine guns on it, and it was coming down. And what they do if they think there's North Vietnamese or Viet Cong soldiers along that canal, they'll open up fire. And I said, they're coming from a distance. And I said, I don't like the looks of it. They're coming in too low. If they know it's us and we're the American soldiers, they would have pulled up and flown away because they know we got this area covered. But they're coming right at us, and they're coming in low, and they're coming in fast. So I told the platoon, everybody bail out, go to the left and go to the right and get as far away from this canal as you can. So everybody deployed on the left and the right, and they came, and sure enough, they opened up fire, friendly fire, and just strafed that whole area where we were walking. If we had not gotten out of the way, we would have probably all lost our lives. And in about 2005, I went out to Ohio. This platoon, my wife has hung it up in the house in a prominent place, but it just said they the platoon said, "Thank you, Lieutenant Renker, that we don't think we would be here if you hadn't made that decision that day." And I don't think I would have been, and I don't know why. John, I think it was God. I just felt inside of here, it was a decision I had to make, and so therefore we got out of the way. And just in 2015, September, I went to a reunion in Tennessee, and a fella I hadn't seen, my machine gunner, came there. He said, "Lieutenant Renker," he said, "I owe my life to you." He said, you saved our life that day." And I said, I don't know what it was. All I wanted to do was survive too. I wasn't going to be reckless. And so they, that's how we survived, by being as smart as we could be. Next thing is I want to say is what we call collateral damage. This, just anytime you have a war, if there's bombs, there's explosions, there's other things that take place, and people can get hurt. I remember the story, and I want to say this. When I was a kid, I liked the story of Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys that was during our Revolutionary War. And they used to hide like the Indians in the woods and come out in camouflage, and they would come out and shoot at the redcoats and the British. And it was frustrating for the British to fight that guerrilla warfare. So I'm in Vietnam, and my thought was, we're the redcoats. No matter how you slice it, we're the redcoats, we're the big target, and they're the ones, this is their land, this is a difficult war, I'm not sure how well we're going to do. So let me show you our weapons that we use. The Colt M16 rifle was used, it was made here in Hartford. The problem with the Colt M16s, some of you, anybody remember what the problem was with them? What?
They would just jam city.
They would jam.
All the time.
When a rifle fires, there's gunpowder. The exhaust from the shell, the gunpowder from the shell would get into the chamber, and the tolerance of it was so small that after a few shots with it, that the next bullet would not extract. It would stick in there. I had one of them. And during one of the ambushes, I fired 3 shots, and then it would jam, and I couldn't get it unjammed. It was totally useless to me. Now I'm in the middle of war, and my rifle's not even going to fire. They eventually fixed that, and we had to meticulously keep them clean. Okay, next. M60 machine gun. Look at this. Look at all the bullets right there that came. They came in a big ribbon and would go through the machine. We had a machine gunner, and then I had to have 2 other men in a platoon just to carry the bullets. But you got somebody coming at you, this was like you see in the movies, you know, shoot me up kind of a thing. And we had some very excellent machine gunners. And people, it was 120 degrees, and the soldiers got to carry that gun over one shoulder, and others are carrying this. Some of the soldiers were carrying 40 to 60 pounds of equipment with them. And if any of you were in the infantry and had that duty, God bless you. We had some wonderful, brave, courageous, hardworking, strong young men, and I'm proud to be an American. I'm proud of the guys I served with in Vietnam. They were great heroes, and they were wonderful men. Can you give me an amen on that one? All right, praise God. Okay, the next weapon was, we had the weapons platoon. We had the same type of a thing. You throw a rocket in there, and it shoots it out to the enemy. And we carried these things, and if they were heavy, we had to break it down, and 2 different people carry it. These are men from my actual platoon. This is a fella, Jim Yates, that I saw recently, and setting up in a pit. And then we would dig a pit and put it in there and then fire from that when we were in camp. Next is a grenade launcher. This thing has got a big tube, and the bullet, if you can call it a bullet, but it's not a bullet, it's actually a grenade, but it shoots like a gun, and you can shoot it about 200 yards, and it works like a mortar, depending on what angle you shoot it at. And there's a sight, you can shoot it 50 yards, 100 yards, 150 yards. And this is great, because you can send a grenade further than you could throw it. A beautiful weapon. I believe they still use this in the Army. I think it's a great, great tool. Next, helicopters. This is called a Bell Huey gunship. You'll see this in most of the Vietnam movies. They're still around. And this is one, this was the workhorse. And to be honest with you, what we did, we would get on these. I'll come to that later. But this was a real workhorse, and this was one of the first wars that used extensive use of helicopters. Next, we had jets. This is an actual picture I took the day of one of the ambushes. we had a bomb called napalm. Anyone ever hear of napalm? A napalm bomb had a gel-like fire substance that would light on fire. And when that bomb went off, it would leave a trail of fire. So what would literally happen, together with that fire that you see, this gummy gel would stick to trees, it would stick on the ground. If there were vehicles in tunnels, it would literally suck all the oxygen out of the tunnel and suffocate them. And so the day we got ambushed from out of the tunnels, we stepped back, and they gave me the radio, and in my role as a platoon leader, I could call in from a jet and call it in, give it the coordinates on the map of where it had to come in, and it would come in and it would bomb. I got to tell you what, this was a lot better than walking in there with a rifle. How many of you agree? And to think that we had this power available to us, so when it got hot and heavy, pull back, call in the big guns, and save a life. Okay, let me talk about the Army. These are guys in my platoon. This is Jody Patterson. He was a machine gun operator. This is Wayne Clark. He's a real deal friend of mine. He is in the state of Ohio. He's in the track Hall of Fame. He was a sprinter in high school. He went on to be a track coach, a retired track coach in the state of Ohio, and took many young men to state championship. He was a special ed teacher. This fellow has passed away as of now, but these two guys, I saw them recently at the reunion. Wayne's a great guy. He travels around, and what a wonderful American he is. And great guy. On this side are some of the guys from the platoon. This fella here was Sergeant Harris, the most decorated, one of those decorated men in the history in the Vietnam War. One of the top 3 decorated soldiers. He did not get the Medal of Honor, but he got 3 silver stars. He was wounded, bandaged himself up, continued fighting, and he's still around too. He was at one of the reunions recently. And this is the better part of we were young. I want to say this. We were young. Go to the next slide, please. We're young, we're integrated. I want to say this, and committed. We had, in my unit, black men, Hispanic men, Mexicans, with people from all over the country. I was trying to give some guys instructions on how to use the mortar that were in my platoon, and they were not getting it. And what happened, go show the next slide. And then I found out that 3 of the men in my platoon, I looked at their service cards and found out that they were illiterate. They could not read and they could not write. They were from West Virginia. And I said, oh, no wonder. I'm giving them instructions, they can't read. And because they were drafting, they needed soldiers. They were drafting people who were willing to fight. So then we had to contend with people who were not educated in that way. One of my squad leaders was Sergeant Stewart here, a black man, a terrific soldier. Over here, you can see a mixture of fellow back middle. There's a black fellow here, he was killed. A fellow here, Medina, he was killed too, Mexican. And this gentleman right here, Walter Washik, he came to my platoon after I had been there a couple of months. He was 18 years old. He had a baby face. And I don't think he had ever shaved in his life. And I was only 21 years old. And here's an 18-year-old. I said, oh man, why'd they send him here? He's so young. He's just like, he looks like baby brother. He looks like he shouldn't be here. Maybe he lied about his age. He's just a kid. And we were going through a village, and we got ambushed. And we carried him out dead 2 weeks later. Somebody sent me a photograph 2 years ago. They have named a bridge in the state of Massachusetts after him, the Walter Washik Memorial Bridge. And I think it's appropriate that we honor our veterans. And he was just a kid. He only spent about 2 weeks before he got killed. And they named the bridge after him. I just think that it's great that we do things like that in our country, and that we continue to do things like that. So these are some of the fellas that you see. At one time, the captain of our unit was a black man. We had the Army didn't know, was integrated, is what I'm trying to say. And it tears me up to see the news now and see our country torn apart along racial lines and all of this kind of stuff. We fought together. We died together. In other words, we worked together. We worked together as a unit. Did the guys always get along? No, there were fist fights. There were guys cursing at each other. But when we got out there and we were facing an enemy, we worked together. We work together. And I happen to believe that we can still work together in our country. We can still work together in our neighborhoods, in our towns, in our cities. I happen to believe that. I just believe that. Okay. I promised I wouldn't preach tonight, but I'm sorry. I'm not preaching. I'm making a political statement. Okay. Okay. Next, let's go about the air assault. In the Huey, we would load up about 8 or 10 guys. Next slide. And what they would do would take us out somewhere. They first send one in to lay down smoke. That's what I took these pictures. Lay down smoke along a tree line so that helicopter has an attachment that just puts a smoke. And then when we land in the helicopters, remember, we're exposed in an open field. So they put the smoke, so when you jump out the helicopter, you're screened from the enemy until you can make your way to the tree line. Next slide. Okay, here's the way we would come in formation. You see the helicopters are kind of in a V formation with 2 in the back, like Canadian geese flying in. And then they would all land at once. And as they got down near the ground, as soon as it was high enough off the ground, they didn't actually touch down on a lot of occasions. You jumped off. When they were 6, 5, 4 feet, they would go as low as they could. Everybody would jump, you'd clear it, and then they would swoop in, you'd jump off, and they would fly away, and there you are, somewhere out. You're out in the middle of. And now the idea was, they would think that there was enemy activity, and they wanted you to go out and find them and shoot them. But to get there, you were exposed in an open field for a period of time. Next slide. And here's just one of them coming down, and some of the soldiers you can see running away. There's some excellent Vietnam movies where you can get a feel for some of this stuff that we took place. And it was coming in the most dangerous time when you first landed. Once you got on the ground, then you could get down, you could crawl, you could do things, but you were exposed when you landed. All right, next. Okay. The other type of warfare was searching villages, and they would send us through villages because they would look for enemy tunnels, look for weapons. That's a picture of me on the bottom right, as I would have looked with my grandkids. Take a look with grenades and a rifle and all my equipment on me there. A canteen, you carried a couple canteens of water, a metal helmet, and that type of thing. But we would encounter, now this to me was the hard part about the war. I love, anybody like kids? I love kids. So you go in the village, and there's kids, and the kids come out to greet you, and the kids, GI, you got candy, you got Coca-Cola, and they would be, the kids, wherever you go around the world. As a minister, I've traveled around the world to some foreign countries, and kids are always the first, they know no fear, and so your heart is touched by these kids, and you got to remind yourself, we could be in an enemy village. And it I'll be honest with you, it kind of messes with your mind, because you want to be nice to the kids, and yet some of these same villages, they'll come out and they'll be the ones shooting the mortars at you at night. But let me tell you something about the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. The way they operated was that they often came into villages and they would say, we're recruiting, this village has to give so many young men to be soldiers. And they would recruit 12 and 13-year-olds. 14-year-olds. So their draft was different. And if somebody in the village said, you're not taking our kids, they would summarily stand up and shoot them in the head. And they'd say, anybody else want to protest? And that's the way they operated. And they terrorized. They didn't play by the same rules that we did. And they would terrorize the village and take young kids to be into service. And sometimes you could never trust. They had booby traps on bicycles. They would load a bicycle full of explosives, send the kid into the camp where a bunch of GIs were, and he'd park his bike, and then he'd pull trigger and walk away, and the bike would explode. Just like you see the terrorists do in our country nowadays. So this was a really somewhat of a dangerous thing. Next slide. Now here's a truck full of GIs. One time, very seldom did we go by truck, but occasionally we did. Now you'll see these kids, they're selling things. Now, I really got a feeling that this war wasn't working very well. On the occasion when we went over by the Cambodian border, we got on the helicopters, we flew in over there, and we landed like in this, it was in a, like not a populated area. We didn't see a hut or a village around. We were out in a wooded area where they thought they were encamped. And we jumped off the helicopters, and the smoke was clearing, and we're all there laying down. Is everybody okay? Is everybody down and everything? And then the smoke clears, the helicopters are gone, it's perfectly quiet, and all of a sudden I say, hey, GI, want Coca-Cola? Nice and cold. We got ice. And we go over, and then they were selling postcards, they were selling all kinds of things, and I said, they knew we were coming. Somebody at the battalion headquarters had a map with the things, and they went in and went and told, and they were ready for. I said, how are you going to win a war when they know you're coming? And that could really scare you too, if they know you're coming. And a lot of times, I like to put it this way, they sent us out as bait. Maybe that's not the way to tell it, but they didn't know where the enemy was. They would send us out hoping that we would get shot at and draw some fire. Then we could engage and destroy the enemy. But most of the time, we just got ambushed or sniped at. And so it was dangerous every time we went out. Now, I want to just pause here and just say that sometimes you ask yourself, because I got some young people here, how do you do it? How do you do it? If your job every day, I tell people in my church now, I said, don't ever complain about going to your job. Because my job was every day to get up and do this kind of stuff. So don't say, I don't like my job, I'm tired of my job. You can do, there's a lot of things we can do as human beings. But I came to believe this. If it was God's will for me to die, I was going to die. If it's God's will for me to live, I'm going to live. So you have to be somewhat fatalistic about it. So just go, do your duty, and leave it in the hands of God. And I was not a church attending person at this time. I was on the outs with God at this time. But I just had a fatalistic, I'm going to go out and just do what I have to do. And I'm going to do my job. And if I make it through, great. If I don't, that was fate that would happen to me. So I'm glad I'm here tonight, by the way. Praise God. I got a bunch of grandkids. I got a beautiful family, and I'm enjoying my life. Hallelujah. I made it home. So next slide, please. This is typical of going through the field, going through canals like this that were chest deep, and this is some of the people from my platoon here. That's me there, my radio operator up in the back there, and we would come out of being in the water, and we oftentimes, I'm saying this for just so you know what we contended with, there were leeches in the water. I don't know how they knew this. Well, you could walk through just 30 seconds or 2 minutes walking across the water, and you come out, and black leeches suck on you and they suck the blood out of you, will be attached to your legs and arms, and you'd have to then go and get a Zippo lighter or something and heat them up, and they'd release you. But they were huge. Leeches would be hanging off you, and there were all other kind of things that we faced that day. It was rough work. Let's keep going here. Here's a typical in the field here. There's a machine gunner, Jody, with the machine gun set up. Some of the other guys there. Our company commander there, I tell you, was a black gentleman, wonderful man. Another one of the lieutenants, a friend of mine, Dean Walker. Next slide, please. This is other things. There were the kids that we encountered, gardens. I told you it was agrarian. Here are cities, cattle and things. So most families use them. They use them to plow the fields. And there were some other thing called water buffalo. They're a little more, they're grayish and they're a little more fierce looking. And there was a time we got charged by a water buffalo. I mean, this huge thing was charging us, and my machine gunner said, he's the enemy. And we got in big trouble with the village that day because that's their work animal. It was like, I'll tell you, you're down south and you shot up somebody's pickup truck, you'd be in big trouble. And so this is kind of what you're facing. Next slide, please. Here's a chow line. Up here, when we'd have chow, and down here, oftentimes, this was a crater made by when we would drop a 500-pound bomb. It would make a crater like this. So I remember flying into the country on the airplane before we landed, just before, and as I'm looking over the country, I thought the country had acne. It was cratered all over. I said, man, there really is a war going on here, because the country was loaded with these bomb craters and all over the place, and that's the damage done by, now that's something we had on our side, so I'm thankful for that. Okay, let me catch up with my notes. Now, we had to contend with other things. Number one, come up here, snakes. This is my platoon, and guess what we found? That's a python there, pretty good sized one, huh? So about half my time in Vietnam, I slept on the ground, out in the jungle, with just a little blanket over me. That you slept out there, and you got to think that there's stuff like this crawling around out there.
But you know how to eat it.
Huh?
But you knew how to
If we got it, we're going to eat it. Yeah,
you're
that's right.
jungle.
Yeah, that's good. Hey, Leslie, good going there. And so that was one of the things. Next thing there were tigers. There were tigers in Vietnam. We never encountered any tigers. They were more up in the north. Next, number 3, the water buffalo I mentioned. Number 4, wild boar. Oh, I tell you what, wild boar, these are these things that they'll charge you. Have you seen any of those reality shows in the United States with the wild boars, where they got these wild boars? They are fierce, and they get going about 30 miles an hour, and they got big tusks coming out of them. And I remember one of my pointments yelled, he screamed, and I said, what's that? He said, boar, boar, boar. We weren't sure what he was saying, and we were in a wooded area, and I remember getting behind a tree like this. And everybody got behind a tree, and this thing came, and it was huge. It weighed about 300 pounds. He was like a linebacker for the Chicago Bears at full speed, running right on through. And so we had wild boar. And then the next one were giant killer bees. And we had one time my flank man wasn't paying attention, and it's all brushy, and he knocked down a nest. And in tropical areas, the bees, like the bees we have around here, how long do you say, half an inch long or something like that? The bees over there were over an inch long and had a correspondingly big stinger on the end of it. And so the guy who knocked down the bee's nest we had to call a medical helicopter to take him out. He went into shock. He had so many bee stings on. But then the bees swarmed the rest of us. And I had a platoon walking in perfect formation, point men here, flank men there, and everybody, and then all of a sudden, the bees. And next thing I knew, there was a stream about a quarter of a mile, and I saw everybody said, order, order, order. Nobody paid attention. Everybody went running. The whole unit went and jumped in the stream to get free of the bees. And I remember saying, something, that's a booby trap the Vietnamese haven't thought of. I just keep bees in a jar and let the GIs come against them. But we had bees and we had fire ants. You just sit down on the ground and they would bite you, go up your legs, go down your neck. Many times I had to have them. Now, I'm going to ask the young kids to leave the room if I could. I don't want some of the little, if you want, you can ask your mom, but what I'm going to show you next is, I want to say, was some of the horrible things that I saw there. If your moms think it's okay. Okay, let's take the next slide. I call it the horrific. These are things you had to encounter. It's a human skeleton that we came across. I don't know if it was an American. I don't think it was. I think it was a Vietnamese. And it had just been killed. The body was left there. And then the insects and all that stuff had cleaned off. There's certain types of beetles and we'll clean all the flesh off of it. So you come in, and there's a body. It's war. Next picture. This was a leg, a human leg, with a sandal still on it. And I remember when we came across this, I said, how do you end up with a leg in the middle of a field? And it goes with war. Somebody said war is hell. War is horrible. It is. And I remember, it's like, this is horrible. The next one I want to show you is particularly interesting. It's a human skull that we found. And we're just walking, and there it was sitting in the grass. And one of the guys went over, and we dehumanize enemies. In World War II, the Germans weren't Germans, they were Krauts. When I was a kid, we used to play war up in the woods. I don't know. some of you remember, we used to play war. And they would say, aha, I got you. With one team had to play the Krauts and one team played the Americans. And if you were the enemy, you were a Kraut. And I realized I'm of German heritage. And I didn't like it. I remember, I don't want to be called a Kraut. I don't want to be called a Kraut. That stands for sauerkraut for short, by the way. But here, so one of my fellows said, went over it, well, like he was going to kick it like a soccer ball. He said, that's the enemy. I said, this enemy ain't going to hurt you. Number one. Number two, it's so obviously set in the field, it could be a booby trap. That if you kick it, something's going to explode. And number three, that's somebody's son.
It's a child.
That's a human being. And it's somebody's son. And I was brought up as a Christian that you do unto others if you would have them do. I think that mother, that family deserves, there's a war going on, the war won't last forever. And that family would want to get, if that body or if there's dog tags or any identification, would like to get that child back, just like we in this country. And I said, don't touch it, we're just leaving it here. And we moved on from here. Because even though you're in a war, you don't have to become an animal. You can still have respect. And you can still show honor to a fellow human being. By the way, I have a friend of mine who several people went back to Vietnam, and they like the Americans over there now. The war is over. And one of my friends became an officer, a general in the Army. And he went to one of the areas where we'd been in the war, and he went to a restaurant there and found out that the owner of the restaurant was a woman who was a colonel in the North Vietnamese Army. Was a colonel that owned a restaurant. And he said, I was in the Army here too. I was in this area with the U.S. Army. And they got talking, and the woman went in the back, said, would you wait a few minutes, and came back and gave him a medal. Said, if you fought in those battles that I was involved in, you're a hero. And gave him a North Vietnamese medal for heroism. Now, he said, I may be the only guy in the United States Army that has a medal for heroism. But in other words, the war is over. She didn't charge them for their meal. And every time they go back to Vietnam they go to that restaurant and get another free meal. So that's the way it is now. The war is over, okay? So let's take I'm going to wrap up with saying, this is a place called Nuit Bogdan. It's a mountain. We had a communication tower on top of that. Next slide. We were flown up there. My platoon and another platoon were flown here because it had been overrun by the Vietnamese. And all the Americans on top, most of them were killed. We were sent in there the next morning to secure it, like to bring security and safety and defend it, and to make sure there were no more enemy soldiers there, and also to deal with the damage that had been done. Next slide. So here's us. There was like a landing field base on top of this mountain. Next slide. And here you could see the destruction that was done. The buildings were blown up. Our duty was to go about collecting the dead bodies. Next slide. There's Captain Hart. I was part of A Company, the 2nd and 12th Infantry. I was the weapons platoon. That's me on the upper right. And down below, you see the radio towers that were all destroyed. It was a total mess up there. Again, the next slide is going to be a little difficult, but this was some of the enemy soldiers, the Viet Cong. You can see they did not even have a shirt here, and a wood frame for a backpack, maybe a belt of some sort. This fella here had been obviously shot in the head, and there's a couple of them down here. That large black thing was a fuel bladder. It contained fuel. They blew that up and drained all the fuel out of it. That would have been gasoline to run the generators and that. So there were enemy soldiers up on top of that mountain. And then this next slide I want to show you. In this slide, it's not clear, but I'll have a hard time with this. But these are the bodies of American soldiers, most of them 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, that we had to collect and bring them all to this landing zone. And then there was a team that came in and got their dog tags, identified them, put them in what they call body bags. They're big bags, they zip them up. and they take them. There were 23 bodies that we collected that day. This is horrible duty to have to do. And it really touched me because those guys didn't get to live out their life like I've had the opportunity. Their lives ended. They got sent home. Families have wept over them, and they never got to live the life. But they gave their lives for our country. They gave their lives to stem the tide of communism, which was believed to be an enemy of a free world that we so desire. The Vietnam War wasn't popular with a lot of people. There were protests for the war. And I tell people that when I came home after my year there, I got off the airplane in Oakland, California at the air base, and there were protesters. And as I got off the plane, so glad to be home, the protesters were calling us names, calling us stupid, calling us names because we had gone to fight a war that they didn't think the U.S. should be fighting. Well, don't take it out on the soldiers. And as I walked along, they were spitting on us. And I said, I risked my life. I'd served my country honorably to come home and get spit on. I don't think it's right. And we have a term, sometimes we use, I'm not receiving it. I'm not accepting that I'm worthy to be spit on. I have my dignity. They can spit all they want. It's not going to take me down. I was proud to serve my country, and still am proud to serve my country. And a lot of Vietnam veterans didn't get their due. They didn't get their due. But I took pride in what I had done, and I took pride within myself, and the war ended some years later.